first thing you want to do is make sure to lay down your pants as flat as possible. You want all the seams showing and you want them to be as flat. I use weights. I also have a chalk line drawn on there that is the grain line. Make sure you find the grain line of your pants as well and then flatten down all of the seams. Then we're going to take the pen tool, the shortcut is P, and start tracing right on the seam line. And you can see right there, it's right on the seam line. It's okay if all the lines don't line up exactly with the seam. Make sure the nodes or little squares that you're drawing with the pen tool do line up right with that seam. And as accurate as you can be is how accurate your pattern is going to turn out. So again, just make sure those seams are as flat as possible. And if your pants are larger than your projection, you will be able to shift while you're tracing. We'll just mark some things. You'll see me shift a little bit later. So don't be too worried about that. Just make sure you are calibrated in Affinity Designer or whichever program that you're using. And then start tracing those lines once it's as flat as possible. If your pants have elastic on the waistband, just make sure to stretch those out when you are tracing near the waist. Now here you can see that I am going in full screen mode and back again. A simple click of the tab button in Affinity Designer will go switch you between full screen mode and not full screen mode. Okay, now I'm using the node tool shortcut A. So grateful when you are in full screen mode, you just use the shortcuts. And now I'm just moving that line. There was a couple of the parts of the line that didn't line up exactly with the seams. So I'm just clicking on the line and lining it up right with the seam line to make it as accurate on that seam all the way up through the crotch and up to the waist. And anywhere there's a seam is where you're drawing, and we'll make a new pattern piece for each zoom line. Okay, you can see even when I go between full screen mode and not full screen mode, it moves it, but once you go back. Now I'm going to start tracing the back of my pants. I'm going to lay as flat as possible, and I'm going to choose so I can see the inseam. Because of the way the pants are made, I can't see the side seam on these pants yet, and I'm going to show you how I will do that. But first we're going to go ahead and use the pen tool, P, to trace the seam line of the back. And then when I get to that side seam, I'm going to measure how much is overlapped. Okay, so I use my measuring. I had to move it a little bit, and that was okay. I just line it back up the side seams. And I'm measuring how much is overlapped to the side seam, and then I am marking it where it would be if it was all the way unfolded. So just measure and mark. And you can see that the back pant piece pattern is coming together. So I've got the front and I've got the back. What I'm doing here is I'm just going to check the inseams and the side seams to see if they match with my measuring tape. And they do. So I know I've done it correctly. That was just a quick check. I also want to make sure that I draw in the grain line on my pattern. So make sure you do draw your grain line in on your pattern. Now I'm going to draw the yoke piece, and I only need to draw half of it since I can unfold it in Affinity Designer. You can draw the whole thing, it really is up to you. I'm going to re-show you what I did in the projection, just in Affinity Designer. I pulled up a picture of pants. I've got my pen tool up. I'm in full screen mode. I push tab. Now I'm going to use the pen tool to draw along the seams. And again, it would look more accurate when it was on actual pants. But I'm just going to show you what I did. I close that. You can also push enter to end your pen tool. Then I'm going to type in A. That's going to change it to the node tool. And then you can fix those lines and make them go around the curves if they didn't meet right on those seam lines with the node tool. And then you would want to make sure that you get every seam line. So if I want the pockets, I'm going to come back with the pen tool and I'm going to make the pockets as well. And there, you can see my lines are not as dark as you might want them to be. That's an easy fix. I'm just going to push tab and then I'm going to come over and change my lines. Let's go ahead and change them green so that you can see them. Go to stroke and I'm just going to change the stroke size on there. You can also click on any other lines that you made and put in what stroke size you want and change the color as you want as well. And that's just so you guys can see kind of what I've done. And you would want to do that for the back pants as well, and marking any pockets. I would also go ahead and mark where the fly stitching is here. So you have that on your pattern, and we'll smooth that out as well. I'm going to use the node tool and smooth that out, make that more of a curve. And you can always come in and adjust it later. You can zoom in and adjust it later. But that's kind of an example so you can see kind of up close. Don't forget the waistband as well. You'll need that measured. You could probably do that as measurement and just draw a rectangle in Affinity Designer once you have measured that. Also, don't forget to come over and trace the pockets, trace the stitching, any seams that you see that you want to keep and preserve, don't forget to use those. Okay, looking at that crotch curve, often when you are drafting patterns, you can use your French curve, and you could definitely use this in your projection and trace your line around a French curve if you like, but I found just using the nodes was well enough to fix the curve, and I just clicked on those nodes and I changed them to a smooth node. And you will get little blue handles and you can adjust the curve and how that looks. And I found that that worked just fine for the crotch curve. And you can also add an asset to Affinity Designer that is a French curve if you wanted one in there. But I've found I like the curves that it creates with the node tool. You could use an actual French curve and your projection to correct those lines as needed. But you can see I'm just kind of going in there and I'm fixing those curves. Now, don't forget to go ahead and use the text box and write in what those pattern pieces are and the directions for them. So since this one needs to cut and mirror image, make sure you write those full directions. So I am writing front pant leg cut to mirror image on there. And I'm just using the text box to get that in there, and increasing the font size so you can see it when you project it. And you can make it as big or as small as you want. It's your pattern piece. Then what I am going to go ahead and do here is I'm just straightening up that grain line. When I drew it on the projection, it wasn't quite lined up, and I want everything lined up on the grain line for my projected. So you can see I just used the rotate tool to get everything lined up, and you can't see it in the video, but I do have the grids in Affinity Designer turned on. You can use view and go to show grid, And I'm lining up those grain lines with the grid so that I know they're all lined up there. And again, just using that move tool to rotate them and line up the grain lines that I drew from the pants. Remember, on the pants, I used chalk to mark my grain lines. And so I'm just going to go through and make sure everything is labeled and everything has the grain line lined up. The next thing I did is I went ahead and selected every single pattern piece there and I duplicated it, Control J, and I also changed the color of the duplicated pattern piece. And I did this because I wanted to see the original seam line, the stitch line, and when I add seam allowance, I want to see where the seam allowance line is. And that's why I duplicated it. So it's totally up to you on whether you choose to do that or not, but I wanted to see where the seam line that I drew was before I added my seam allowance in there. Okay, so now I'm using the contour tool on the front leg pattern piece here to go ahead and add my seam allowance. Okay. And the radius is the amount of seam allowance. And I do have a full tutorial on adding seam allowance. If any of this is confusing to you, I have a complete full tutorial on adding seam allowance to a pattern and how to do that correctly. The importance is after you type in that seam allowance, and go ahead and bake your appearance in there so that you can edit those seam lines. And I went ahead and added a 5/8 seam allowance. The seam allowance is a personal preference for you. I wanted to have a little bit of a larger seam allowance, especially when I was making my toile or my muslin, because if I needed to make some adjustments to it, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. If I had a little bit larger seam allowance in there, I can make a few little tweaks. So go ahead and add the seam allowance on what you would like to use for your seam allowance. Once you're satisfied with your pattern, you have seam allowance added and it's laid out, you can either open your pattern piece in Affinity Designer and zoom to your calibration zoom and cut out straight in Affinity Designer from your projection, or you can export as a PDF and open in Adobe. Either one should be correct. Don't forget to add a little calibration rectangle, 16 by 24, something like that, that you can check that it is accurate in actual size. And then you're ready to make your muslin or toile of your new pattern. When you're happy with your muslin or your toile and how it fits, then you are ready to go ahead and make your final product. I found when I made my muslin that it fit excellent. I love the way it fit. The only thing I adjusted is I wanted a little bit more space in my calves. The original pattern pants were a little bit tighter there, so I went ahead and added a little bit on my pattern to there so I could have more room in the calf. And I found that my toile fit great, so I jumped right in to sewing my jeans.